For many centuries, London was a dangerous place. It was a magnet for the very worst kind of people. Jack the Ripper dominated the headlines. But he wasn't the only killer around. Murder was afoot. The fear of death was everywhere. But police had their work cut out to track the culprits down. In this series, we'll be investigating some of the city's most notorious and intriguing crimes.
Female defendant.
Sexual intrigue, vicious murder, as well as the latest technology, fed the nation's insatiable desire for gruesome stories of London's dark side.
If your lordship pleases. Members of the jury, it now becomes my duty to address you for the first time in the defense of this accused man, who, as I have already made quite plain, I hope, is not asking at your hands a verdict of not guilty. That has never been the position at all. He is asking at your hands, under the direction of his lordship, when you have heard all the evidence, that you return a special verdict of guilty of the act charged, but insane at the time. In other words, guilty but insane, as it is called.
John Christie is one of the most notorious serial killers in history, and one of the most despicable characters ever to have lived in London. We left our story with Christie breaking down in court at the sentencing of Timothy Evans for the murders which Christie himself had committed. Evans was hanged on the 9th of March, 1950. Christie had killed Evans' wife and child, and hidden them in the washhouse at the back of the building they all once shared. Suspecting Evans as the killer, the police searched the property and found the bodies where Christie had left them. He had developed a method of gassing his victims and rendering them unconscious before he would sexually and physically assault them. By 1950, he had killed 3 women and 1 child, and watched a man hang for his crimes. Christie would return to married life with his wife Ethel at the already infamous address of 10 Rillington Place. But this house of horror would become even more synonymous with evil as Christie continued his murderous journey. John Christie had escaped detection for his first 2 murders. His 2 victims, Ruth First and Muriel Amelia Eady, lay buried in his back garden and had not been uncovered by the police when they were investigating Timothy Evans. Christie must have felt untouchable. On the 31st of March 1953, John Christie was apprehended by the police on Putney Bridge. Although on trial for only 1 murder, his other heinous crimes would soon be revealed.
When she was unconscious, I believe. I think I strangled her then.
With what? Do you know?
I think it was a stocking.
Go on.
I think I tried to get down beside her again and attempted to be intimate with her as I strangled her, and I couldn't. My back was so bad I just could not.
And that was up in her room, was it?
Yes.
And Mrs. Evans was then on the floor.
Yes.
And then you found she was dead.
Yes.
What did you do immediately? Did you move her at all, or did you leave her there?
No, I left her there.
Did Evans come back?
He came back in the evening.
And where was she then?
It was dark.
Was she still in front of the fire?
Yes.
After Timothy Evans' execution on the 9th of March, Christie tried to return to life as it was before.
Christie really went back to normal, as if nothing had happened. It elevated him in the community a little bit, you know, because he'd been in the papers and everything, and he played on that. And he played the victim, basically. Oh, terrible thing happened at Terrington Place. Oh, me and my wife got to get over this. And he also played on his arthritis and everything to get sympathy, you know, and his bad back and everything. But it pretty much went to normal. And but he didn't commit a murder for a while.
He and his wife Ethel continued to dwell in the downstairs flat at 10 Rillington Place, but their lives had been forever altered by the trial, and the neighborhood they lived in was changing dramatically as well.
It was actually pretty heavily racist, really. It was a time in the 50s of no blacks, no Irish, no dogs. West London was mainly very poor white people and black people who just arrived in London from the West Indies. They were the ones who were at the mercy of the slum landlords. Poor accommodation, often dangerous wiring, damp, and people could be evicted very quickly, you know.
The Christies hated their new neighbors. They complained to the authorities of their, quote, dirty habits. And there were frequent arguments with their new landlord who had purchased 10 Rillington Place. The previous owner wanted rid of it following the trial of Timothy Evans.
I think Christie was disturbed because Christie was an archetypal Little Englander. He was from the north of England. He was very blunt. Although he was very softly spoken, he was very entrenched in his views. He was a coward and very timid, so he wouldn't have been openly racist to anyone. But I think, like many working class white men of that time, he had racist views.
John Christie, of course, was reluctant to move to another location. He always guarded access to the garden fiercely, for his two undiscovered victims, Ruth First and Muriel Eady, were not buried deeply there. Indeed, the Christies' beloved Irish terrier, Judy, had already dug up a thigh bone, and around the time of the Evans investigation had even uncovered a skull. Christie managed to dispose of that in a blitz-damaged building nearby, but it was clear that any new tenant taking over his flat and garden would inevitably discover the bodies. So John Christie was trapped in a house he could not leave, in a house where he had no control. Months passed, and all Christie's old anxieties and insecurities reasserted themselves more strongly than ever. He saw doctors for anxiety and insomnia, but they could do nothing about the deep and irresistible frustration that burned within him.
Christie, being the character he was and being the man of violence and sexual violence that it was, the relationship between him and his wife deteriorated. It may be that his wife realized what had happened about Timothy Evans being convicted and executed, and that might have been the reason why John Christie actually killed her.
He said she's suffering ill health and she was getting pills. He woke up one night and there she was, and she was sort of gasping and choking, and he didn't like to see her suffer, so he strangled her and put her under the floorboards in the front room.
You hid the body under the floorboards?
Yes.
And did everything you could to prevent everybody from finding it?
I suppose it looks that way, yes.
You knew it was there all the time.
Well, I did not want to be separated from her. That is why I put her there.
What?
Is it quite true what I said?
What did you say?
I said that I did not want to be separated from her. I did not want to lose her. That is why I put her there. She was still in the house.
He strangled her in bed. There wasn't a sexual motive. He really got rid of Ethel so that he could murder other women, you know, because she was the thing holding him back. He told neighbours, conversely, that she'd gone to visit her relatives in Sheffield, and he told the other neighbour that she'd gone to Birmingham.
Christie had quit his job at this point and lied to his neighbours that he had a new job waiting for him in the north and that Ethel had simply gone on ahead to make arrangements. He must have known the lies would unravel before too long, but that did not matter to him now. Christie was able to carry out an even larger killing spree. He had already murdered 5 at his home in Notting Hill, and the victims to come would ensure that 10 Rillington Place would always be one of London's most notorious addresses. John Christie had murdered his wife Ethel in the early hours of Sunday the 14th of December 1952. Ethel lay dead for 2 days until Christie finally disposed of her. He wrapped her body in a blanket, prized up the damp and rotting floorboards and shoved her into the space below. He had plans to explain her sudden disappearance. 2 days before he murdered his wife of 30 years, she'd written a letter to her sister Lily in Sheffield. She asked Christie to post it. Instead, he kept it. With her now dead, Christie put the rest of his plan into action. He changed the date on her letter and posted it off to Sheffield on the 15th.
Now look at the letter, Exhibit 11. When you wrote that letter, you knew your wife was dead and that you had killed her, didn't you?
Well, I must have done.
Well, let me read it to you. First part of it. Ethel has got me to write her cards for her, as her rheumatism in her fingers is not so good.
Yes.
Of course, that was complete invention, wasn't it?
No, not entirely. She had suffered from rheumatism for quite a long time. Her fingers were rather swollen up.
She had not got rheumatism then because she was dead.
Yes, that is quite true.
The doctor says she will be okay in 2 or 3 days.
Yes.
How could you possibly say that?
I don't know. I was just writing down everything that came into my head, I suppose.
Just writing anything that came into your head.
Yes.
I am rubbing them for her. Her fingers?
Yes. Well, I had been doing that for a number of years for her.
Well, that was meant to convey that you were looking after your wife very kindly, wasn't it?
Yes, it seems that way.
As soon as Ethel can write, perhaps by Saturday, she is going to send a letter.
Yes.
That was intended to deceive, wasn't it?
It seems so.
That was to keep the family quiet, wasn't it?
No, that was not a thought. That was never entering my head.
Because you knew you had done something wrong that you did not want to be found out.
No, I disagree.
He covered it up by writing to her relatives and saying that she had terrible rheumatism, she can't visit you, and she can't write to you. And that worked for a while.
You wonder what was going through John Christie's mind at this time, and you can speculate that actually he was on a downhill spiral, and he must have had some guilty feelings about how he had effectively sent Timothy Evans to his death through execution.
Christie may have been carrying around some sense of guilt about the hanging of Timothy Evans and possibly a modicum of sorrow after the murder of his wife Ethel. These 2 deaths, for which he was solely responsible, enabled him to kill freely, and 3 more women would fall victim to his desires. But Christie wasn't the only serial killer terrorizing London at this time. The capital was also being plagued by the crimes of John George Haigh, the acid bath murderer.
John George Haigh was born in 1909. His parents were members of the religious sect, the Plymouth Brethren. And so he had, by most people's standards, a tough upbringing.
His childhood was extremely enclosed and isolated. His father built a big fence around the house. He wasn't allowed much contact. He was a choir boy. He was very controlled.
When he reached 21, he suddenly discovered there was easier ways of making money than working for it. This was when he began getting involved in crooked enterprises with cars and insurance, which would make him money.
He was one of these people who seemed to live in hotels and conduct a life of crime one way or another. I don't think he probably ever paid his hotel bills.
He went to prison for fraud. He showed no violence towards anybody. I think he turned to violence because he was a bit of a megalomaniac and he thought he'd invented the perfect way of killing. He cut out so many risks and not being caught. But what he didn't realize was you have to be careful that you don't kill people that have people who care about them.
He came to notoriety because he was talking to Mrs. Olive Durand Deacon. She was a widow, age 69. He said he was a businessman, and he had this idea for a new kind of artificial lady's fingernail, and she was very interested in that. I think he probably wanted her to put some money into the venture. So he offered to take her down to his business at Crawley so that she could see for herself. Actually, what happened was that he shot her, put her body in a 40-gallon drum of acid.
Haigh had already killed 5 people and disposed of their bodies using this method by the time he met Mrs. Olive Durand Deacon. He had murdered a former employer called William McSwan, and then when the parents became concerned about his sudden disappearance, he murdered them too. Having run out of money due to his gambling habit, he then killed another couple and stole their possessions. But the disappearance of Olive Durand Deacon would finally bring his murderous reign to an end.
When Mrs. Durand Deacon was reported missing, the police were called and they interviewed Haigh. The police were stunned. Haigh said, yes, she did come with me, but you won't find her because I killed her.
They were concerned that they wouldn't find any trace of her. But the pathologist noticed an object which he recognized as a human gallstone. And actually, her false teeth survived, and so did her plastic handbag. Even though he had claimed that he could have disposed of the bodies with a guarantee of success, it wasn't so, and there were still these small items that were left from Mrs. Durand Deacon's remains.
He became a megalomaniac. He realized he was getting away with it, murder after murder, and nobody was arresting him. And this led to him thinking he could do anything he wanted.
John Christie must have had the same sense of invincibility as John George Haigh after he'd escaped justice for his crimes and Timothy Evans had been executed. After Christie murdered his wife Ethel a little before Christmas in 1952, he was free to indulge the darkest side of his character. He concocted all sorts of explanations for his wife's sudden disappearance and began to search for other female victims. He would never have to leave the down-at-heel area of West London to find them and satisfy his violent sexual urges. He embarked on a murderous path to self-destruction, the outcome of which would shock the nation and uncover one of the most sensational miscarriages of justice of the 20th century. Childhood bullying and sexual repression had manifested themselves in an unassuming killer. 4 women and 1 child had already fallen foul to this monster. More were a certainty. Christie picked up and murdered 3 women in the first months of 1953. Kathleen Maloney, Rita Nelson, and Hectorina McLennan. He killed them using the same method he'd used to murder Muriel Eady a decade earlier. First of all, rendering them unconscious with carbon monoxide, and then strangling them to death.
Now we turn to Rita Nelson. Do you remember Miss Nelson? Her photograph is an exhibit in the case somewhere.
Yes.
Where did you meet first?
Notting Hill Gate.
Notting Hill Gate. Where?
In a cafe.
Was she alone, or was somebody with her?
She was with a friend, a girlfriend. The 2 of them together. The cafe was quite full, and there was not much room, but there was a vacant seat at their table, so I sat with them.
Did you get to talk to her?
Yes. She spoke to me and asked me for a cigarette or a match. I'm not quite certain which. I think it was a cigarette she asked me for. And then she kept the conversation going, and, she said they were looking for some different place to stay, to live.
Looking for accommodation?
Accommodation. And so it was then that I suggested that there may be room at my place, that I may be leaving, and they decided to come down. They arranged to come down together later in the evening to see it.
They were both coming?
They were both coming. They arranged to come together.
Did they both come or not?
No, just one.
Once Christie had murdered his wife and left his job, he was able to dedicate his time purely to murder. He would spend a lot of hours in the Rainbow Cafe on the corner of Rillington Place and found that it would be useful for meeting prostitutes and also potential victims.
John Christie must have had some arrangement whereby he invited the women to Rillington Place if they were prostitutes. Presumably this was part of the normal transaction.
Kathleen was a prostitute in the Ladbroke Grove area, very close to Notting Hill. He invited her around for sex, probably paid her and then took the money back, like he always did. And then he gassed her with his tube, strangled her and raped her.
It is all hazy, is it? Had you any reason or malice to hurt that girl?
No, I did not want to hurt her. I've never hurt anybody.
I ought to ask you about Maloney. When she was dead, what did you do with her body?
Well, I just do not know that.
Well, we know it. Millard and the jury, and all of us know it. It was found in the cupboard in the alcove in the kitchen. You know that now, do you not?
Yes, I was told later that it was, but I do not remember it.
How it got there, you do not know. I don't suppose anybody else could have put it there, but you do not remember it.
It must have been me.
Now, Rita Nelson, her body was found in the cupboard. Do you know how that got there?
I do not remember that alcove at all.
You must have put it there if it was found there. No one else could have done that.
It seems certain that I was, but I do not remember anything about that alcove. I know it was there, but I do not recollect it or having used it.
There were other potential victims too, but they were lucky and managed to escape his attentions just in time. But Christie must have known that this was unsustainable.
I think by this time Christie was self-destructive. he'd given up. He was starting to cave in because he did love his wife. We know that for a fact. And he'd been with her for years and years, and she'd done a lot for him, supporting him. So to kill her really was the final nail in the coffin for him. And the way that he left his final 3 victims as well in the house, he knew they would have been found very quickly.
The bodies began to rot and smell. People complained. Unable to work and without his wife's income, Christie was running out of money. He sold Ethel's wedding ring and her jewelry. Most of the furniture in the flat was gone. Finally, he sold the one thing he had left, his tenancy. He sublet the flat to a couple. Discovery was now inevitable. On the 20th of March, 1953, Christie walked out of 10 Rillington Place with a battered suitcase containing his only belongings. He would never return.
The stink is something quite indescribable. And one of the other tenants noticed the appalling smell in the house. They've got to go through the killing ground to the outside toilet.
The tenant was Beresford Brown, who lived on the top floor and had been allowed to use Christie's dilapidated kitchen. When he was cleaning it up, he discovered the source of the foul stench.
He was re-wallpapering. While he was doing that, he touched the wall and there was a hollow sound, and he realized there's nothing behind it. And so he punched through the wallpaper and he saw a woman's back trussed up, and there were 3 women tied up in the kitchen cupboard alcove. And Christie hadn't even sort of nailed down a door or something. He just wallpapered over it. Just shows how panicky he was and how quickly he was trying to get away.
The police are called. Ethel is found under the floorboards. They turn over the garden and they find the bodies of the 2 victims murdered some 10 years before. One of whom, the root of a plant, has actually grown through the vertebrae, and the bones are mixed in with other bones in the garden.
March 1953. John Christie is wandering aimlessly around London. The bodies he's hidden at number 10 Rillington Place have been discovered by the new tenants, and now he's the most wanted man in the country. On the 31st of March 1953, Constable Tom Ledger sees a man in Putney leaning over the railings, staring into the River Thames. He recognizes him as John Christie and immediately arrests him.
Christie was arrested really by chance, early one morning, a foggy morning.
The policeman spots him on Putney Bridge and asks him to take off his hat, and there's the bald dome and the glinting spectacles, and he is arrested.
He had hardly any money left, just a few coins left. It was the end, really. So Christie probably knew he was going to be caught. He probably always wanted to be caught.
What were you doing between the 24th of March and the 31st of March when you were at Putney being arrested?
Well, I just do not recollect, really, what I was doing. I must have been just walking round and round all the time.
You have no recollection at all of what you were doing?
No. I remember one time I was at a crossroad and I think I saw a sign which was strange. It said Barking Road, and then I asked where I was and somebody said I was at East Ham.
Were you deliberately hiding yourself from the police?
No. I was... there was one particular occasion I recall, as though it was yesterday. I was standing, I think, this was after I'd been at East Ham and was on my way back to Kensington. There was a policeman holding the traffic up and beckoned me to go across. I didn't want to go across, but I went across and thanked him as I passed. I went to the other side of the road. I remember that very, very clearly.
Once John Christie was captured, his violent murders would be revealed. When it became clear that he was responsible for the death of Beryl Evans, it was obvious that a huge judicial error had been made and that Timothy Evans could well have been innocent. The same year that Christie stood trial, another innocent man would be sent to the gallows. Both cases would contribute to the abolition of capital punishment. The other unfortunate individual was 19-year-old Derek Bentley. He and his friend, Christopher Craig, who was 3 years his junior, attempted to carry out a burglary which went horribly wrong.
Derek Bentley was born in 1933, and he got very limited intelligence. He was friends with Christopher Craig, who suffered badly from dyslexia, and he enjoyed sort of collecting and using guns and knives and such like.
Bentley and Craig plotted to burgle a warehouse belonging to the Barlow and Parker Confectionery Company in Croydon. Craig armed himself with a modified gun, but the plan was thwarted from the off as they were witnessed gaining access to the property via a drain pipe.
Police were called and they climbed up to the roof of the warehouse by various means.
Bentley was quickly arrested, but Craig tried to escape the police and threatened them with a revolver, saying that he would shoot, and in fact he did start shooting. The police were unarmed, and coming out on the roof, one of the policemen, Constable Miles, was killed.
During Craig's shootout with the police, Derek Bentley had already been captured and arrested and was in custody at the time of the murder, but both would find themselves in court.
The law said that if both were involved in a joint enterprise, and as in this case, one of them used a gun to kill, then both were equally guilty. So on that definition, Bentley was guilty of murder, as was Craig.
You got the situation where the person who fired the shot was spared the death penalty because of his age, and the person who had aided and abetted the murder was executed and thereby got a more serious penalty from the law.
Derek Bentley was executed on the 28th of January 1953, and immediately there was a campaign to secure him a posthumous pardon. It would take 4 decades to procure, but in 1993 his pardon was issued. The case of Derek Bentley highlighted the public unease at the use of the death penalty, and many people began to rally against this irreversible form of justice. What the movement needed, though, was a poster girl, and this would come in the form of Ruth Ellis, the last woman to be hanged in Great Britain. Ellis killed her lover, David Blakely, a hard-drinking racing driver. Their on-off relationship was a particularly violent one.
Ruth Ellis, in 1955, was 28 years old. She was described as a rackety, good-time girl. She ran a club in the West End. Ellis had an affair with David Blakely, and it was a sort of rather tempestuous relationship.
She became obsessed with his movements, became very jealous of what he was doing and whether he was involved in other relationships.
This jealousy eventually got the better of her, and on the 10th of April 1955, Ellis travelled to the Magdala public house in Hampstead with a gun, where she waited for Blakely to leave.
Ellis shot him, brought him down, went up to him and emptied the gun into him as he laid on the ground. She was arrested and taken to a police station and charged with his murder.
There's no doubt that she intended to kill him, so the law was clear.
During those 3 weeks, while public controversy mounted, one man had a terrible decision to make, Home Secretary William Lloyd George. As he went about his public duties, he had to decide whether or not to write the grim words, "The law must take its course." But in the end, he had no choice. As the law stands, and as precedent dictates, Ruth Ellis had to die.
On the 13th of July, 1955, Ruth Ellis was hanged by Albert Pierpoint. There would be no protests or campaigning for the murderous John Christie during the trial at the Old Bailey. Crowds would gather, but not to offer sympathy, only to catch a glimpse of the monster in person. As the word spread of his chilling crimes, 10 Rillington Place, the site where the murders occurred, would also begin to attract crowds. It would not be long before John Christie suffered the full force of the law. But in bringing justice to the victims, grave and fatal flaws would be exposed in both the police force and the British legal system. On the 31st of March 1953, Police Constable Thomas Ledger arrested the most wanted man in the country. The corpses of 4 women had already been discovered in his house. 2 more victims from far earlier were soon to be found buried in his garden. Whilst in custody, he began revealing the details of his morbid life story.
Once he was in custody, he was quite quick about confessing. He confessed to 7 murders, but never admitted to the murder of the baby, Geraldine. He would never admit to that. But we are 99.9% sure that he did murder the baby as well.
There are opposing views as to why Christie confessed to murder. Was it an attempt to prove his madness and thus aid his plea of insanity? Nothing is ever clear in the case of John Christie. In an attempt to save John Christie from the noose, his defense team at the trial would argue that Christie was indeed insane. The man defending him was Derek Curtis Bennett. He was a well-known defense barrister. For Curtis Bennett, insanity was the only plausible strategy for excusing the sick and violent crimes Christie had committed. The prosecutor, Sir Lionel Heald, however, didn't have to try too hard to convince the jury of Christie's guilt. All the evidence was stacked against him. It took just 85 minutes for them to decide the verdict.
I think Christie probably had personality disorders rather than being insane. A massive inferiority complex sexually, and like most rapists and murderers of women for sexual motives, he wanted power. And the only time he could get power was with a prostitute or with a dead woman. It's terrible to say, but it was like mannequins for him. It was his way that he could do what he wanted.
Prisoner at the bar, you stand convicted of murder. Have you anything to say before judgment of death is passed according to law?
John Reginald Halliday Christie, you have been found guilty of murder by the jury, and for that crime there is only one sentence known to our law. That you be taken from this place to a lawful prison, and thence to a place of execution, and that there you be hanged by the neck until you are dead, and your body buried in the precincts of the prison in which you shall be last confined before execution. And may the Lord have mercy upon your soul.
John Christie was executed on the 15th of July, 1953 by Albert Pierpoint, the same executioner who'd sent Timothy Evans to his death 3 years earlier.
I think the fact that Timothy Evans had been executed And it might well have been a miscarriage of justice which could not be corrected, did have an effect on the debate about capital punishment in this country.
It helped lead to the suspension of capital punishment, and the 50s was a terrible time for miscarriages.
Along with the executions of Ruth Ellis and Derek Bentley, the hanging of Timothy Evans played a huge role in the abolition of capital punishment in the UK in 1965. All three murder trials and their accompanying death sentences provoked massive public reaction and were seen as terrible miscarriages of justice, both at the time and today.
I think the whole history of how capital punishment came to be abolished is quite an interesting one. You have some cases where there's clearly an anomaly and some injustice, and you would say Timothy Evans was a miscarriage of justice, and if you have a death penalty, then you can't correct it afterwards.
Timothy Evans eventually received a posthumous pardon, but the controversy around what happened to him changed the country forever. This pardon would be issued in 1966, 16 years after Evans' execution, even though just before his own execution, John Christie had actually confessed to the murder of Timothy's wife, Beryl. It's thought he was responsible for 8 deaths in total. But Christie had been a member of the Wartime Reserve Police in World War II. He would have had many opportunities in that position to carry out murders and cover them up. So, we can never be sure. After John Christie's death, the area where he committed his crimes, Notting Hill, became one of the most fashionable and desirable in the city. It just goes to show that while London might have been home to some of history's most wicked individuals, she always bounces back. As we've seen in this series, the murder maps of London may be dotted with sites where the most horrendous crimes took place. It hasn't stopped her remaining one of the world's great cities.